The Wyoming wind didn't just blow. It screamed, carrying grit that stung like shattered glass against exposed skin. For 3 agonizing days, Clara Higgins sat on the splintered bench of Blackwood Station, her modest Boston trunk serving as a mocking monument to a promised future. The man who had penned her hundreds of poetic letters, the man who swore on his mother's grave to meet the 3:15 Union Pacific, was a phantom, starving, parched, and clutching a faded tintype photograph. Clara was ready to surrender to the unforgiving prairie. Then, through the shimmering heat haze of the third dusk, a bloodied rider appeared, slipping from his saddle into the dust to whisper the words that would upend her entire existence. The hiss of the Union Pacific steam engine sounded like a dying beast as it pulled away from Blackwood Station, leaving behind a thick cloud of black soot that settled heavily onto the Wyoming dirt. Clara Higgins stood perfectly still on the wooden platform, her hands tightly gripping the handle of her leather satchel. She was wearing a heavy, dark blue wool traveling suit, a garment perfectly suited for the crisp, refined autumns of Boston. But a suffocating trap in the relentless, baking heat of the Western Territory. As the rhythmic clacking of the train faded into the vast, empty expanse of the prairie, a profound and terrifying silence rushed in to take its place. Clara turned slowly, her eyes scanning the horizon. There was no bustling town. There were no welcoming committees, no horse-drawn carriages, and, most importantly, no tall, broad-shouldered cowboy holding a bouquet of wildflowers. There was only a weathered, slanted building that served as the station house, a rusting water tower, and endless miles of sagebrush stretching toward bruised purple mountains in the distance. "Train don't come back till Thursday, miss," a gravelly voice announced. Clara startled, turning to see the station master. Horace Grimsby was a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the arid earth. His face was a map of deep, sun-baked wrinkles, his beard stained yellow with tobacco, and his right leg bore a heavy limp, the legacy of a collapsed silver mine down in Colorado. He leaned heavily against a push-broom, eyeing her with a mixture of pity and weary annoyance. "I am not waiting for the train," Clara said, forcing her voice to remain steady. She lifted her chin, calling upon the rigid posture she had maintained during her years as a governess for the wealthy Abernathy family back east. "I am waiting for Mr. Jeremiah Collins. He is my fiancé. He sent word that he would meet me here today." Horace spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Jem Collins, you say?" He squinted out toward the north road, a winding ribbon of dirt that disappeared over a ridge. "Ain't seen Jem in near a month. He runs cattle up near the Sweetwater. It's a hard ride. Maybe he lost track of the days." "Mr. Collins is a man of precise words and steadfast promises," Clara replied firmly, reaching into her satchel to brush her fingertips against the thick bundle of letters tied with a pink silk ribbon. "He assured me he would be here." Horace merely grunted, turning back to his sweeping. "Suit yourself, lady. But the sun goes down hard out here, and the coyotes don't care much for fancy Eastern dresses." Clara took a seat on the singular, splintered wooden bench beneath the meager overhang of the station roof. She placed her satchel in her lap and pulled out the top letter. The handwriting was elegant, sweeping, and impossibly refined. "My dearest Clara," the letter began, dated just 3 weeks prior. "The Wyoming sky is vast and terrifyingly beautiful, but as I sit by the campfire tonight, it cannot hold a candle to the hope you've given me. Your letters are the only tether keeping my soul grounded in this wild place. When you step off that train, I will be the first thing you see, and I swear to spend the rest of my days ensuring you never regret leaving Boston." A tear threatened to spill over Clara's eyelashes, but she angrily blinked it away. She could not afford to cry. She had nothing to return to. Mrs. Abernathy, a bitter and jealous woman, had falsely accused Clara of stealing a pearl brooch, effectively ruining Clara's reputation and making it impossible for her to find respectable work in Massachusetts. The mail-order bride advertisement she had answered in the Boston Herald had been an act of sheer desperation, but Jeremiah's subsequent letters had transformed her desperation into a genuine, blossoming love. Hours bled into one another. The sun reached its zenith, turning the air into a shimmering, oppressive blanket of heat. Clara's corset felt like an iron cage constricting her lungs. She rationed the small canteen of water she had purchased in Omaha, sipping only enough to wet her parched lips. As afternoon shifted into evening, the sky exploded in violent hues of orange, crimson, and bruised violet. The temperature plummeted with shocking speed. Horace emerged from the station house, locking the heavy iron padlock on the ticket office. He carried a coarse, moth-eaten wool blanket. Without a word, he tossed it onto the bench beside her. "Station's locked, miss. Can't have you sleeping inside with the cash box. Company rules, but you can use the bench. If you hear a rattling sound in the brush, don't go investigating. It ain't a friendly neighbor. He will come tomorrow," Clara whispered, pulling the foul-smelling blanket around her shivering shoulders. He must have met a delay. Horace looked at her, his eyes softening just a fraction beneath his bushy brows. "I hope you're right, miss. For your sake. Because out here, a delay usually means someone's dead." With that chilling thought, Horace walked away toward a small cabin 100 yards out, leaving Clara completely alone in the sprawling, terrifying darkness of the Wild West. The wind began to howl, and somewhere in the distance, a chorus of coyotes began their frantic, yipping screams. Clara clutched the letters to her chest, praying for the morning sun. The second day dawned with a blinding, merciless brightness. Clara awoke with a stiff neck and a deep, gnawing ache in her stomach. Her elegant blue traveling suit was now coated in a fine layer of pale dust, and her carefully pinned hair had begun to unravel, damp with the cold sweat of a restless, fearful night. Horace arrived just after sunrise, carrying a dented tin cup steaming with black coffee. He handed it to her without a word. It tasted like scorched earth and bitterness, but it was hot, and it gave her a fleeting burst of energy. "Still here," Horace observed, unlocking the station door. "Still waiting," Clara replied, though the iron certainty in her voice from yesterday had begun to rust. By noon, the heat was worse than the day before. Clara moved from the bench to the sliver of shade cast by the water tower, her eyes constantly scanning the north road. Every dust devil that spun across the prairie made her heart leap into her throat, only to crash back down when it dissolved into nothingness. During a brief lull in his duties, Horace brought out a stool and sat near the edge of the platform, whittling a piece of pine with a pocket knife. Clara, desperate for distraction and reassurance, decided to press him for information about her betrothed. "Mr. Grimsby," Clara began, her voice hoarse from the dry air. "You said you know Jeremiah. What is he like? Is he as handsome as his photograph?" She withdrew the tintype she kept tucked in her bodice, a picture of a ruggedly handsome man with striking eyes and a strong, square jaw, holding his hat over his heart. Horace squinted at the photograph and let out a low, rumbling chuckle. "Handsome? Suppose you could call him that, if you like a man who looks like he's been dragged behind a horse through a cactus patch. Jem's a hard worker, I'll give him that. Can rope a steer faster than any man in the territory." Clara smiled, relieved. "And his poetry? He wrote me such beautiful verses about the mountains and the rivers." Horace stopped whittling. The knife paused mid-stroke. He looked up at Clara, his brow deeply furrowed. "Poetry? Yes," Clara said, pulling out a letter. "Listen to this. The wind through the canyon sings a lonely ballad, a melody that begs for the harmony of your laughter. It is quite breathtaking." Horace stared at her for a long, silent moment. Then, he let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed across the empty platform. "Miss Higgins, are you pulling my leg? I assure you, I am not." "Miss," Horace said, his amusement fading into a look of genuine concern. "Jem Collins is a good man with a branding iron, but he's dumber than a box of rocks when it comes to books. He can barely read a wanted poster, let alone write down a word. I've seen him sign for freight deliveries. He uses a shaky X. The man ain't ever written a letter in his life." The breath rushed out of Clara's lungs as if she had been struck. She looked down at the beautiful, flowing script in her hands. The elegant loops, the perfect grammar, the soulful sentiments. If Jeremiah couldn't write, Who had been corresponding with her for the last 8 months? Who had she fallen in love with? But the photograph, she stammered, feeling the world tilt dangerously on its axis. Oh, that's Jem, all right, Horace said, nodding at the tintype. Taken a few years back in Cheyenne. But whoever wrote them letters, it wasn't him. Panic, cold and sharp, coiled in Clara's belly. She had traveled 2,000 miles, surrendered her meager life savings, and staked her entire future on a man who didn't exist, or at least, a man whose mind and heart belonged to a stranger playing a cruel trick. Before she could process this devastating revelation, a low rumble vibrated through the wooden planks beneath her feet. It wasn't a train. It was horses. 3 riders appeared from the south, not the north road where Jeremiah's ranch lay. They rode hard, their horses lathered in sweat. They hitched their mounts to the post near the station, swaggering up the platform steps with the heavy jingle of spurs. They were rough, unwashed men, smelling of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and trouble. The leader, a thick-set man with a scarred cheek and a filthy bowler hat, spotted Clara immediately. A predatory grin split his face, revealing rotted teeth. "Well now, boys, looky here," the man drawled, stepping closer to Clara. "Seems the Union Pacific dropped off a little Eastern dove and forgot to take her home." Horace stood up, his hand dropping subtly toward the pocket of his heavy coat. "Move along, Cutter. The lady is waiting for someone." Cutter ignored the station master, taking another step toward Clara, trapping her against the wooden siding of the station house. "Waiting for someone? Out here? Sweetheart, the only thing coming out here is vultures and dust. Why don't you come with us? We got a bottle of rye and a fire up at Miller's Creek." He reached out a grimy hand to touch the lace collar of her dress. Clara didn't scream. She didn't shrink away. The sheer, overwhelming betrayal of the letters, the exhaustion of the journey, and the terror of her situation coalesced into a sudden, blinding spike of adrenaline. As Cutter's hand brushed her collar, Clara's right hand slipped into her deep skirt pocket. In one fluid motion, she drew the small, silver-plated double-barrel Remington Derringer she had bought in a pawn shop in Boston. She jammed the cold metal muzzle directly under Cutter's chin, forcing his head back. "If you touch me again," Clara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that she didn't know she possessed, "I will ensure you never drink rye, or anything else, ever again." Cutter froze, his eyes widening as he looked down his nose at the tiny but lethal weapon pressing into his flesh. The 2 men behind him hesitated, their hands hovering near their holsters. The heavy clack-clack of a double-barreled shotgun cocking broke the tension. Horace had stepped forward, the massive weapon leveled at the other 2 men. "You heard the lady." "Cutter," Horace growled. "Back away slow. Mount up, and ride out. And if I see you within 10 miles of this station again, I won't bother asking you to leave." Cutter swallowed hard. He slowly raised his hands, stepping back from Clara. "Just being neighborly," he muttered, trying to salvage his pride. He spat on the platform, shot Clara a venomous look, and turned on his heel. The 3 men mounted their horses and rode out, kicking up a furious cloud of dust. Clara's hand shook violently as she lowered the Derringer. She slumped against the wall, sliding down until she hit the floorboards, pulling her knees to her chest. Horace uncocked his shotgun and leaned it against the doorframe. He looked down at the trembling woman from Boston, a newfound respect in his weary eyes. "You got grit, Miss Higgins. I'll give you that," he said softly. "But grit don't feed an empty belly, and it don't bring dead men back to life. You got 1 more day before I gotta telegraph the marshal in Cheyenne to come figure out what to do with you." That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat on the bench, the Derringer resting heavily in her lap, staring into the blackness. The beautiful letters lay scattered around her feet, no longer a source of comfort, but a terrifying mystery. She was stranded in the middle of nowhere, waiting for a man who couldn't write, manipulated by a phantom who had lured her into a trap. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the Wyoming sun had stripped away the last remnants of Clara's Boston refinement. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin was burned a painful pink, and the once pristine blue dress was heavy with dirt and sweat. Her canteen was entirely empty. Horace had offered her some salted beef and beans, which she had choked down, but her mind was unraveling. The psychological torture of the isolation was worse than the physical discomfort. The silence of the prairie was deafening, broken only by the relentless whistling wind that seemed to mock her foolishness. She spent hours rereading the letters, searching for clues, for some hidden code that would explain the deception. My uncle, Silas Callahan, manages the financial affairs of the ranch, but the land is mine. It is my legacy, Clara. A legacy I want to share with you. She ran her thumb over the name, Silas Callahan. Why would a man mention his uncle so frequently in romantic letters? Had Jeremiah dictated the letters to someone? But Horace had said Jeremiah couldn't string words together, let alone compose poetry. The eloquent, passionate soul, who had courted her across 1,000 miles of ink and paper, was entirely divorced from the reality of the rough-hewn cowboy Horace had described. As the sun began its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dusty earth, a profound sense of finality settled over Clara. The golden hour, usually so beautiful, felt ominous. It was the closing of a door. Jeremiah was not coming. Whoever had written the letters had abandoned her to the wolves. "I'm sorry, miss," Horace said, stepping out onto the platform and adjusting his suspenders. He looked genuinely pained. "Sun's going down. I'll send the wire to the marshal first thing tomorrow. Maybe we can get you on a freight wagon headed east by the weekend. You can sleep inside the office tonight. It ain't safe out here anymore." Clara stood up slowly, her muscles screaming in protest. She gathered the scattered letters, her hands numb. She packed them back into her satchel. She was entirely broken. The fierce, pistol-wielding woman from yesterday had burned out, leaving only ashes. "Thank you, Mr. Grimsby," she whispered, her voice cracking. She turned to follow him into the station house when a sound caught her ear. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the wind rustling the dry sage. But then it grew louder. A rhythmic, heavy thudding. Clara spun around, rushing to the edge of the platform. Horace paused, his hand on the doorknob, turning his head to listen. Over the ridge of the North Road, a massive plume of dust rose into the violet sky. "Someone's coming," Horace muttered, stepping back onto the platform, his hand instinctively resting on his hip where he kept a heavy revolver. A lone horse crested the ridge. Even from a distance, Clara could see that something was terribly wrong. The horse was not galloping. It was staggering, its head hanging low, its coat lathered in thick, white foam. The rider was slumped forward, his arms wrapped around the horse's neck, clinging on by sheer force of will. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She dropped her satchel, the letters spilling out once again onto the dusty floorboards, and she ran to the edge of the platform, gripping the wooden railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Jeremiah," she breathed out, a desperate prayer. As the horse drew closer, the horrifying details came into sharp focus. The rider's duster coat was torn to shreds. His hat was gone, revealing dark, sweat-matted hair plastered to his forehead. But the most alarming detail was the dark, wet stain spreading across his left shoulder, glistening wetly in the fading light. Blood. A lot of it. The horse stumbled to a halt near the water trough, its legs buckling slightly. The sudden stop dislodged the rider. With an agonizing groan, the man slid sideways from the saddle, crashing heavily into the Wyoming dirt. "Lord Almighty," Horace swore, abandoning his post and rushing down the platform steps. Clara didn't hesitate. Forgetting her exhaustion, forgetting the betrayal, she gathered her heavy skirts and sprinted down the stairs, plunging into the dust beside the fallen man. He was lying on his side, gasping for air. Dust caked his face, mixing with the blood pouring from his shoulder wound. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, and strikingly handsome, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw. He looked exactly like the tintype photograph she carried in her bodice. It was him. It was Jeremiah Collins. "Mr. Collins!" Clara cried out, dropping to her knees beside him. She grabbed her handkerchief, pressing it frantically against the bleeding wound on his shoulder. "Horace, help him. He's been shot." Jeremiah flinched at her touch, coughing violently. A fine mist of blood splattered his lips. He rolled onto his back, his eyes fluttering open. They were a piercing, startling blue, but they were clouded with pain and exhaustion. He looked up at Clara, his gaze wandering over her dust-streaked face, her unraveling hair, the frantic, terrified expression in her eyes. He reached up with a trembling, blood-stained hand, his fingers brushing against the lace of her collar. He gasped, his voice barely a rasping whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm late." Tears, hot and fast, finally spilled down Clara's cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face. He had come. He was real. He had fought his way through hell to get to her. "Hush," Clara wept, pressing harder on his wound. "You're here. That's all that matters. You're here." Jeremiah's eyes drifted past Clara, landing on the wooden platform above them. The wind had caught one of the letters she had dropped, blowing it down the stairs until it fluttered to a stop right next to Jeremiah's face. The dying light caught the elegant, sweeping handwriting on the paper. Jeremiah's hazy blue eyes suddenly widened in sheer panic. The romantic exhaustion vanished, replaced by a jolt of sheer, unadulterated terror. He grabbed Clara's wrist with surprising, bruising strength. "Where?" he choked out, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. He pointed a trembling finger at the letter. "Where did you get those?" "From you," Clara sobbed, confused by his sudden panic. "You sent them to me. In Boston. I'm Clara, Jeremiah. I'm Clara Higgins." Jeremiah stared at her, the confusion washing over his bloody features, twisting into a mask of horror. He coughed again, a wet, terrible sound. "I didn't write those," Jeremiah whispered, his grip on her wrist tightening painfully. "I can't write." "I know," Clara cried, trying to soothe him. "It doesn't matter now. You're safe." "No." Jeremiah forced the word out, his body convulsing. "Listen to me. The man who wrote those letters. My Uncle Silas." "Silas Callahan?" Clara asked, her heart dropping into her stomach. "He wrote them." Jeremiah gasped, his eyes rolling back slightly. "To trick you. He needed a bride, to claim the land grant. But he couldn't marry you himself." "Jeremiah, please, stop talking. You're bleeding too much," Clara pleaded, looking frantically at Horace, who was running back from the station with a medical kit. "Listen." Jeremiah yanked her closer, his breath hot and metallic against her face. "He didn't want me to marry you. He wanted me dead, so he could inherit it all as my next of kin. He ambushed me at Miller's Pass. Silas shot me." Clara froze, the blood rushing in her ears roaring louder than the Wyoming wind. Jeremiah let out one final, rattling breath, his blue eyes locking onto hers with desperate urgency. "You have to run, Clara," he whispered, the life fading from his voice. "He knows the train dropped you off. He knows you're alone. Silas is coming for you." Jeremiah Collins' head fell back into the dirt, his eyes staring blankly at the darkening sky, and in the distance, over the howling wind, Clara heard the chilling, rhythmic sound of multiple horses galloping hard toward the station. The rhythmic drumming of approaching hooves vibrated through the floorboards of the platform, a terrifying counterbeat to Clara's racing heart. The Wyoming wind seemed to hold its breath. "Get him inside, now," Horace bellowed, snapping out of his shock. He dropped his medical kit, grabbed Jeremiah by his heavy leather gun belt, and hoisted the unconscious cowboy's upper body. "Is he dead?" Clara gasped, her hands slick with Jeremiah's blood as she scrambled to grab his booted legs. "He's got a pulse, but it's fainter than a whisper in a hurricane." Horace grunted, his bad leg buckling slightly under the dead weight. "Heave, Miss Higgins. Put your Boston back into it." Adrenaline, sharp and blinding, surged through Clara. She pulled with a strength she didn't know her slender frame possessed. Together, They dragged Jeremiah's bleeding body across the dusty platform, hauling him over the threshold just as the silhouettes of 5 riders materialized through the evening gloom. Horace slammed the heavy, iron-reinforced oak door of the station house shut, throwing the thick deadbolt with a resounding clack. He immediately moved to the single front-facing window, smashing the glass out with the butt of his shotgun and throwing the heavy wooden shutters closed, leaving only a narrow slit to peer through. Clara collapsed beside Jeremiah in the suffocating dimness of the station office. The air smelled of old paper, chewing tobacco, and the fresh, sharp tang of copper. She tore a long strip from the hem of her ruined traveling skirt, frantically binding it tightly over the bullet hole in Jeremiah's shoulder to stem the bleeding. Outside, the horses pulled up, snorting and stamping the dirt. The jingle of spurs and the creak of saddle leather echoed in the sudden silence. "Horace Grimsby," a voice called out. Clara froze. The strip of wool slipped from her trembling fingers. The voice was a rich, melodic baritone. It possessed an aristocratic cadence, a smooth, deliberate pacing that was entirely out of place in the unforgiving Wyoming dirt. It was the audible embodiment of the elegant, sweeping handwriting on her letters. "I know you're in there, Horace," the voice continued, smooth as aged bourbon. "And I believe you have something of mine. 2 things, actually." Horace pressed his face near the slit in the shutters, his shotgun resting on the sill. "Silas Callahan, you're trespassing on Union Pacific property. I've already wired the marshal in Cheyenne." A low, sophisticated chuckle drifted through the broken window. "Now, Horace, we both know the telegraph line went dead 3 miles south of here about an hour ago. A terrible windstorm, no doubt. My men and I are just here to collect my nephew, Jeremiah. Poor boy ran afoul of some rustlers at Miller's Pass. And, of course, I must extend my deepest apologies to his intended bride." Clara crept on her hands and knees toward the window, peering carefully through a crack in the wooden slats. Standing in the center of the dusty road, illuminated by the pale light of the rising moon, was a man who looked like a displaced Eastern gentleman. Silas Callahan wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, a pristine white shirt, and a silver pocket watch chain that gleamed at his waistcoat. He was impeccably groomed. His silver-streaked hair swept back from a handsome, aristocratic face. Beside him sat Cutter, the filthy thug from the day before, gripping a Winchester rifle. 3 other rough-looking men fanned out, their weapons drawn. "He's bleeding out, Silas," Horace yelled back. "You take him, he dies." "A tragic loss for our family," Silas replied, his tone dripping with mock sorrow. "But a burden I am prepared to bear. Send out the girl, Horace." "Clara, is it? Miss Higgins, if you can hear me, I assure you, no harm will come to you. You and I have much to discuss regarding your contractual obligations to the Callahan estate." The realization hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. The letters hadn't just been a cruel prank, they were a legal snare. The federal land grants in this territory often favored married settlers, doubling their acreage. By arranging a proxy marriage or a binding contract under Jeremiah's name, and then ensuring Jeremiah suffered a tragic accident, Silas, as the only surviving kin, would absorb a massive, wildly lucrative empire. But he needed Clara's signature, or her silent disappearance, to finalize the theft. "I fell in love with a poet," Clara whispered into the dark, her chest heaving as she looked down at the rugged, illiterate cowboy bleeding on the floor. "But the poet is a butcher." "I ain't sending nobody out, Silas," Horace roared. "You want 'em. You gotta come through my buckshot." Silas sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. He casually flicked a speck of dust from his tailored sleeve. "A pity. Emmett, Josiah. Burn them out." 2 of the riders dismounted, pulling heavy burlap sacks from their saddle horns. They moved toward the side of the wooden station, out of Horace's line of sight, splashing the walls with a foul-smelling liquid. Kerosene. Panic seized Horace. "They're gonna roast us alive, miss. We can't stay in here. We can't carry him out the front," Clara cried, pressing her hands over Jeremiah's pale face. The cowboy let out a low, rattling moan, his skin clammy and freezing. "We ain't going out the front," Horace said, his eyes darting frantically around the dark office. He limped rapidly toward the back of the room, throwing aside a pile of heavy canvas mail sacks. Beneath them was a trapdoor, secured by a rusted iron ring. Old root cellar? Clara asked, hope flaring. Smuggler's tunnel, Horace corrected, gripping the iron ring and hauling it upward with a groan of exertion. Back when the Blackwood silver mine was running, they used this to sneak the high-grade ore past the assayers. It lets out in the ravine behind the station, leads to an old siding track where a handcar is sitting. A sudden, brilliant flash of orange light illuminated the office, followed immediately by the roaring, crackling sound of fire taking hold of the dry, weathered pine of the station's exterior. Smoke began to curl beneath the doorframe. "Grab his arms," Horace commanded. Clara didn't hesitate. She holstered her tiny derringer in her skirt pocket, grabbed Jeremiah by the shoulders, and dragged him toward the gaping black hole in the floor. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. It smelled of damp earth, rot, and the lingering phantom scent of blasting powder. Clara scrambled backward down the earthen incline, supporting Jeremiah's upper half, while Horace took his legs, his own bad knee buckling with every step. Above them, the station house was becoming an inferno. The roar of the flames was deafening, masking the sounds of their frantic retreat. They dragged the heavy trapdoor shut, just as the front window shattered inward, raining burning debris onto the floor where Jeremiah had lain moments before. They navigated the pitch-black tunnel by feel. Clara's hands were scraped raw against the rough dirt walls, her elegant boots slipping on the slick, uneven ground. Jeremiah's breathing was a terrifyingly shallow rasp, his head lolling against her chest. "Keep moving," Horace wheezed from the darkness ahead. Tunnel's only about 50 yards. It felt like 50 miles. Every muscle in Clara's body screamed in protest. She was a woman accustomed to serving tea in Boston drawing rooms, not dragging a dying cowboy through a subterranean dirt grave in Wyoming. Yet, a fierce, protective fire had ignited within her. This man, this illiterate, rugged stranger, had ridden into an ambush, taken a bullet, and still dragged himself to the station just to warn a woman he had never met. He had bled for her. She would not let him die for her. The air grew suddenly cooler, and a faint wash of moonlight broke the darkness ahead. They tumbled out of the tunnel's exit, emerging into a deep, craggy ravine choked with sagebrush and shadows. 100 yards up the steep bank, the Blackwood station was a towering pillar of fire, painting the night sky in violent hues of crimson and gold. Clara could see the silhouettes of Silas and his men circling the blaze, their rifles raised, waiting for the occupants to flee the flames. "Over here," Horace whispered harshly, dragging Jeremiah toward a rusted set of narrow-gauge iron tracks hidden in the tall brush. Resting on the rails was a dilapidated wooden handcar, its iron pump handles thick with rust. "Will it move?" Clara asked, helping Horace heave Jeremiah onto the flat wooden bed of the cart. The cowboy groaned, his head tossing weakly. "It's downhill to the river junction," Horace said, spitting blood he had bitten his tongue in the dark. "If we can break the rust lock, gravity'll do the rest." He grabbed the heavy iron pump handle and threw his weight onto it. It let out a shrieking groan of metal against metal, but it didn't budge. "Help me," Horace hissed. Clara jumped onto the cart, placing her delicate, blistered hands next to Horace's weathered grip. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. They pushed down with everything they had. The rust snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The lever depressed, and the wheels ground against the iron tracks. Slowly, agonizingly, the handcar lurched forward. They pumped furiously. Up and down, up and down. The cart picked up speed, the metal wheels squealing in protest as they rolled deeper into the darkness of the ravine, putting distance between themselves and the burning station. Clara dropped to her knees beside Jeremiah as Horace maintained the pumping, letting gravity take over as the tracks sloped downward into the canyon. She tore open his ruined shirt, inspecting the wound in the moonlight. The bleeding had slowed, but he was burning with a sudden, violent fever. "Jeremiah," she whispered, smoothing his matted hair back from his forehead. "Stay with me. Please." His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. He looked up at her, his lips parting. "Clara," he breathed, his voice rough. You're real." "I am," she said, tears pricking her eyes. "I'm right here. I couldn't read 'em," he confessed, a single tear cutting through the grime on his face. "The letters you sent back. Silas. He read them to me. He made me think you were mine." Clara's heart broke. Silas hadn't just manipulated her. He had manipulated his own nephew, using Clara's genuine, vulnerable letters to string the boy along, ensuring Jeremiah remained deeply invested in the proxy engagement, while Silas orchestrated his murder. "I am yours," Clara said fiercely, gripping his cold hand. She didn't know if it was true love, or trauma bonding, or simply a desperate defiance against the evil of Silas Callahan, but she meant it in that moment. "You saved my life today. We are going to save yours." A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the canyon walls, echoing over the squeal of the handcar wheels. A splinter of wood exploded from the floorboards, inches from Clara's face. She whipped her head around. High on the ridge overlooking the canyon, illuminated by the moonlight, rode 3 horsemen. They had spotted the moving cart. "They found us!" Horace yelled, dropping low on the cart but keeping his hands on the pump to increase their speed. "Keep your head down." Another shot rang out. This one pinged off the iron lever, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. Silas Callahan's men were closing in from the high ground, and the handcar was trapped on a fixed iron path, a moving target in a canyon of echoes. Clara reached into her pocket, her fingers wrapping around the pearl handle of her derringer. It only had 2 shots. Against 3 men with rifles, it was less than useless. But as she looked down at the dying cowboy who had tried to save her, Clara Higgins cocked the hammers anyway. She was done being a victim of someone else's poetry. The handcar plummeted deeper into the twisting throat of the ravine, the squeal of its rusted wheels masking the sound of the raging Sweetwater River that lay somewhere ahead in the dark. Above them, the silhouettes of Silas Callahan's men rode hard along the ridge, their Winchester rifles spitting deadly flashes of fire. A bullet ricocheted off the pump handle, tearing a gash through Horace's heavy wool sleeve. The old station master grunted, but his grip didn't falter. "We're fish in a barrel down here, Miss Higgins," he roared over the din. "The track curves up ahead by the old weeping wall. We gotta jump before the trestle." "The trestle?" Clara shouted back, keeping her body draped over Jeremiah's shivering form. "It washed out in the spring floods of '81, Horace yelled. "Track leads to a 200-foot drop into the rapids." Clara's blood ran cold. She looked ahead into the impenetrable gloom. "When do we jump?" "When I say," Horace commanded. He let go of the pump handle, grabbing his double-barreled shotgun from the floorboards. "Hold him tight. Roll when you hit the dirt." The handcar, no longer being pumped, began to rely solely on the steep momentum of the decline. It rattled violently, threatening to jump the tracks at any second. High on the ridge, the riders had vanished behind an outcropping of rock, momentarily cutting off their line of sight. "Now," Horace bellowed. Clara grabbed Jeremiah by his gun belt and the collar of his ruined duster. With a feral scream of exertion, she threw her weight backward off the side of the speeding cart, dragging the heavy cowboy with her. They hit the embankment hard. The world became a chaotic blur of sharp rocks, tearing sagebrush, and suffocating dust. Clara wrapped her arms around Jeremiah's head, absorbing the brutal impact of the tumble as they rolled down the steep, rocky slope toward the canyon floor. Seconds later, a horrifying screech of metal echoed through the ravine, followed by a hollow, booming crash as the handcar flew off the broken trestle and vanished into the roaring river far below. Clara lay on her back, staring up at a sliver of starry sky through the canyon walls. Every bone in her body ached. Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps. Beside her, Jeremiah let out a low groan, his hand instinctively clutching his bleeding shoulder. He was alive, but barely. "Horace?" Clara hissed into the darkness, crawling frantically toward the shape of the station master a few yards away. Horace was sitting up, clutching his bad leg, his face pale in the moonlight. "Busted my knee proper this time," he wheezed. He cracked open his shotgun, checking the shells by feel. But I still got my trigger finger. You gotta leave me, miss. Drag him into the old mine tailings. There's a cave-in about 50 yards east. Hide there. I am not leaving you, Clara said fiercely, wiping blood from a scrape on her forehead. You don't have a choice. A new voice drawled. Clara froze. The crunch of boots on loose shale echoed from the slope above them. Emerging from the shadows was Cutter, the massive, scarred thug from the station platform. He had dismounted and climbed down the embankment, his rifle leveled directly at Horace's chest. Silas figured you'd jump before the drop, Cutter sneered, spitting a wad of tobacco onto the rocks. I gotta admit, you got more lives than a barn cat, old man. But the ride's over. Horace raised his shotgun, but Cutter was faster. The thug kicked the heavy barrels upward just as Horace pulled the trigger. The blast of buckshot pulverized the rock face 10 feet above them, showering them in sharp granite dust. Cutter brought the heavy wooden stock of his Winchester down hard on Horace's temple. The old man collapsed without a sound. No, Clara screamed, scrambling backward. Cutter racked the lever of his rifle, ejecting the spent shell, and turned his predatory gaze toward Clara and the dying cowboy beside her. Now, Miss Higgins, boss wants the boy dead, but he wants you alive. Wants your signature on a piece of paper, he says. Real romantic, ain't it? Cutter stepped closer, his heavy boots crunching menacingly. Clara's hand slipped into her skirt pocket. Her fingers found the smooth pearl grip of the Derringer. It was a weapon designed for card tables and close quarters, not the wild expanse of a canyon, but Cutter was closing the distance. Don't touch him, Clara warned, her voice trembling but laced with pure venom. Or what, little bird? Cutter laughed, reaching down to grab her by the hair. Clara pulled the Derringer, shoved it directly into Cutter's thigh, and pulled the trigger. The small gun gave a sharp, deafening crack. Cutter howled in agony as the bullet tore through his leg. He stumbled backward, dropping his rifle to clutch his bleeding thigh. But Clara wasn't done. She stood up, her ruined Boston dress hanging in tatters, her face a mask of dirt and fury. She aimed the second barrel directly at his chest. I said, Clara breathed, her hand surprisingly steady. Do not touch him. Cutter raised his hands, his face pale with shock and pain. Crazy Eastern witch, he hissed, limping backward into the shadows. Before Clara could exhale, a slow, mocking applause echoed from the trail behind her. Bravo, Miss Higgins. Truly, bravo. Clara spun around. Silas Callahan stood 30 feet away, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight cutting through the canyon. His bespoke suit was perfectly pristine, entirely unbothered by the chaos of the night. In his right hand, he held a silver-plated Colt revolver. 2 of his men flanked him, their weapons drawn. You are an extraordinary woman, Silas said smoothly, stepping closer. It is a terrible shame my nephew is too ignorant to appreciate a mind as sharp as yours. He can barely spell his own name, you know. I had to invent a soul for him just to lure you here. You are a monster. Clara spat, keeping her Derringer aimed at Silas, though she knew she only had 1 bullet left against 3 armed men. I am a businessman, Clara, Silas corrected gently. The federal government is practically giving away the richest grazing land in the territory, but only to married men. Jeremiah had the claim. I had the vision. I wrote you those letters because I needed a bride on paper. A tragic ambush by rustlers leaves me as the grieving uncle, the sole heir, and you, well, a grieving widow who signs her rights away for a ticket back to Boston. Jeremiah shifted on the ground behind Clara, coughing up a terrifying amount of blood. He forced himself up onto his good elbow, his blue eyes burning with a hatred that transcended his injuries. You won't get away with it, Silas, Jeremiah rasped. Silas looked down at his nephew with cold disdain. I already have, boy. The station is ashes. Horace is dead. And you are bleeding out in the dirt. He raised his Colt, leveling it at Jeremiah's chest. It was beautiful poetry, Clara, but all poems must end. Drop the gun, Callahan. The voice boomed through the canyon like the wrath of God himself, echoing off the stone walls with terrifying authority. Silas froze. He whipped his head toward the southern ridge. Silhouetted against the moonlight were not cowboys, but 5 heavily armed men wearing the dust-covered badges of the United States Marshal Service. At their center stood Marshal Thaddeus Montgomery, a legend in the territory, holding a Sharps buffalo rifle aimed squarely at Silas's chest. "How?" Silas breathed, his sophisticated veneer finally cracking into pure panic. The telegraph wires were cut. They were. Marshal Montgomery called down, his voice carrying easily over the rushing river. "But Horace Grimsby wired me yesterday morning, when your boy Cutter started sniffing around the station. Union Pacific don't take kindly to threats against their men. We rode a special engine down from Cheyenne. Saw the fire from 5 miles out. Put the gun down, Silas, or I'll blow a hole in you big enough to drive a freight train through." Silas Callahan looked at the marshals on the ridge, then down at Clara, who still held her derringer pointed at his heart. The elegant, poetic mastermind realized his trap had sprung on him. With a feral snarl, Silas raised his revolver toward Clara. 3 rifles fired simultaneously from the ridge. Silas didn't even have time to pull his trigger. The force of the marshal's bullets threw the aristocratic killer backward into the dirt, dead before he hit the ground. His remaining men immediately dropped their weapons, throwing their hands into the air. Clara didn't watch Silas fall. She dropped to her knees beside Jeremiah, pulling his heavy head into her lap. "You're safe," she wept, rocking him gently as the marshals scrambled down the embankment. "The poetry is over, Jeremiah. You're safe." Jeremiah looked up at her, his vision fading, but a small, genuine smile touched his blood-stained lips. "I can't write, Clara," he whispered, his hand finding hers. "But I know how to love you." He closed his eyes, and the canyon finally fell silent. The Wyoming sun rose differently over the Sweetwater Ranch. It didn't bake the earth with malicious intent. It bathed the rolling green hills in a warm, golden promise. It had been 3 months since the night the Blackwood station burned to the ground. 3 months of agonizing recovery. The bullet had missed Jeremiah's heart by a fraction of an inch, but the fever had nearly claimed him in the days that followed. It was only Clara's stubborn, relentless vigil at his bedside in the Cheyenne infirmary that had kept his soul tethered to the earth. Clara stood on the wraparound porch of the sprawling ranch house, a pitcher of iced lemonade in her hands. She wore a simple, durable cotton dress, her hair braided sensibly down her back. The pale, terrified Boston governess was gone, replaced by a woman whose skin was kissed by the sun and whose eyes held the unyielding steel of the frontier. She looked out toward the corrals. There, leaning heavily on a wooden cane but standing tall, was Jeremiah. He was directing a group of ranch hands, his voice carrying the rough, practical authority of a man who belonged to the land. He wasn't a poet. He didn't know the works of Keats or Byron. He ate with his elbows on the table and his boots were perpetually covered in dust. But when he looked at Clara, there was no deception. Jeremiah spotted her on the porch. He tipped his hat, excusing himself from the men, and limped slowly toward the house. As he climbed the steps, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "Got something for you," he said, his blue eyes warm and shy. Clara set the pitcher down. "What is it?" Jeremiah opened the book. Inside, the pages were filled with shaky, oversized, incredibly crude letters. It looked like the handwriting of a child just learning to hold a piece of charcoal. "Doc Evans' wife in town has been teaching me," Jeremiah muttered, suddenly looking very embarrassed. He pointed to a line on the first page. "It took me a week to get this right." Clara leaned in. The letters were wobbly, the spelling atrocious, and the ink was smudged. It read, "Clara MYWIFE MYLIFE. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She reached out, tracing the rough, smudged ink with her fingertip. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever read. Silas Callahan had used elegant calligraphy to build a prison of lies, but Jeremiah had used his own agonizing effort to build a foundation of truth. "It's perfect, Jeremiah," Clara whispered, stepping into his arms. He held her tight against his good shoulder, the scent of leather, horsehair, and honest sweat wrapping around her like a blanket. Inside the house, sitting on the mantelpiece above the roaring fireplace, was a small wooden box. Inside it rested a bundle of perfectly written letters, tied with a pink silk ribbon, alongside a silver-plated derringer with 2 empty chambers. They were relics of a nightmare, kept only as a reminder of the fire they had walked through to find each other. Years later, the Sweetwater Ranch became one of the most prosperous cattle empires in the Wyoming Territory, built not on fraudulent land grants, but on the unbreakable partnership of a rugged cowboy and a fierce Boston bride. Clara Higgins and Jeremiah Collins never spoke of Silas Callahan again, letting the dust of the prairie bury his elegant lies forever. Instead, they built a life defined by hard truths and quiet devotions. Jeremiah never became a master of prose, but every anniversary, he proudly presented Clara with a single, handwritten sentence, each one a little steadier than the last. Clara kept those crude, smudged notes in a velvet box, treasuring them more than any poetry ever written, for they were the true language of a man who had bled to prove his word and a woman who had fought to keep him.